Today on BRStv Investigates, does UV sterilizer flow rate matter? Can a UV sterilizer be the right tool to avoiding that seemingly inevitable ugly brown phase of setting up a new tank? Today's results start us down a path of finding out, and we may change the way we approach UV sterilizers forever. Hi, I'm Randy with this Friday's BRStv Investigates, where we put popular reefing gear, theories, and methods to the test by experimenting on our own tanks so you don't have to experiment on yours. And in today's experiment, we find out if UV sterilizers can help avoid that ugly brown phase of setting up a new tank, whether you're using brand new dry rock or old established live rock. And within that, does the flow rate you set your UV sterilizer to really matter? Almost every reefer who has set up a brand new tank has probably experienced the ugly brown diatoms, cyanoalgae, or maybe even dinoflagellates, and it's been recommended that you can either deal with it and embrace it, meaning just wait it out, or sometimes it's recommended to try to avoid it altogether by using previously established mature live rock. Both options aren't without their headaches, such as potentially exposing your tank to a variety of nuisance pests or algae that lived in the system your live rock came from, or having to embrace that seemingly inevitable brown town of using new dry rock until your tank matures and you develop a balanced bacterial colony and maintenance rhythm to get it under control. In either case, it's not fun if you have the misfortune of running into one of these scenarios. When we set out on today's UV experiment, we simply wanted to see if there were any noticeable or measurable differences between tanks set up with brand new dry rock as well as tanks set up with well-established live rock, both with and without a UV sterilizer installed. In order to do this one right, not only did we have to test tanks with and without a UV sterilizer, but since Pentair UV manufacturer has two recommended flow rates, one for lower flow protozoan sterilization with a tank turnover and contact time optimized for fish parasites, and one with a higher flow algae and bacterial sterilization with lower contact time but higher turnover optimized for faster replicating organisms like bacteria and algae blooms. Because of that, we had to test both new and old rock setups using one of each flow rate. Here's how we got that done. We set up two experiments using 6 Red Sea Max E170 tanks with an AI Hydra 26 lighting option that was set to a spectrum that many reefers would use on their own tanks. In the first experiment, based on established live rock that has been in a sump area of the tank for a couple of years, we aquascaped 3 of the tanks with live rock from our large testing and storage tank, which have potentially been exposed to a variety of different algae, bacteria, and critters. Tank 1, or our control tank, had no UV sterilizer installed. Tank 2 had an 18-watt Pentair UV sterilizer installed with a flow rate set to that lower flow protozoan or fish parasite sterilization level, and Tank 3 had the same 18-watt sterilizer installed but set to a higher flow rate optimized for algae and bacterial sterilization. To help dial in the flow rates of the respective UV sterilizers, we used a Neptune Systems flow sensor on each one to set the flow within the manufacturer's recommendation of around 48 gallons per hour on Tank 2 and around 360 gallons per hour on Tank 3. Nearly identical to the first experiment setup, our second experiment utilized the exact same equipment and flow rates. However, instead of using mature live rock, we aquascaped another set of 3 tanks using brand new Reef Saver Rock fresh off the shelf. This is rock that has never seen an aquarium before and almost certainly one of the most common options reefers start a new saltwater tank with. Keep in mind that the 6 tanks are brand new, uncycled, bare bottom setups where the lights were turned on max from day one, and what I believe is probably the most difficult path possible for setting up a new tank, so the results today are based on this extreme environment. With a daily photo period of 10 hours, including a ramp up and ramp down time, we let the tanks run for 2 months while documenting each tank from week to week. Today's data should be pretty exciting to look at since it's all visual comparisons, which will allow you to draw your own conclusions about what we see. Okay, so let's put your eyes to the test by breaking down each experiment, one with established live rock and the other with new dry rock, from week 1 to week 8, broken up into 1-month segments where I'm sure you'll be surprised at how starkly different the first month is to the second month. Starting with the first experiment of 3 tanks full of wet, established live rock that we pulled from our holding tanks, as would be expected in week 1, from the control tank 1 with no UV to the higher flow UV Sterilizer tank 3, they all look similar and bone white, so no difference at all. Week 2, we see nearly identical progress between tank 1, 2, and 3, where they are all exactly the same and still bone white. In week 3, we start to see some brown coloration growing on the non-UV tank 1, as well as some slight brown dusting in the protozoan low-flow UV tank 2. Yet in tank 3, there's hardly a speck of brown to be seen, maybe a spot or 2 here and there if you were looking hard enough. It's after 4 weeks or the first month of testing that we really notice a dramatic change across the established rock experiment, where in the control tank without UV, all of the surfaces exposed to direct light have started to grow a firm layer of green algae. Looking at tank 2 at the lower UV flow rate, we see a similar algae growth on the surfaces that directly faces the light, yet in tank 3 that has a UV sterilizer flow rate set to algae and bacterial sterilization, it seems that the algae growth is present, just not as prominent as the other 2 tanks. From the looks of it initially, the algae growth does seem to slow down on tank 3, however it has no effect on the algae that's already established on the surface of the rock. Now looking at the second month of testing, after 5 weeks, it's clear to see that across the tanks 1, 2, and 3, algae that has already rooted itself on the rock is continuing to grow thicker and thicker as the weeks progress. We're still seeing some slowed growth in UV test tank 3 that is set to a rate for sterilizing algae, but outside of that, there's not a dramatic effect on the existing algae. Week 6 looks to be the same, with the ulva algae on all 3 tanks growing thicker, yet now we're seeing signs of it on the bottom of the tank, and by week 7, I'd say that all 3 tanks, from no UV sterilizer to sterilizers at 2 different flow rates, are growing and are covered to similar amounts. Looking at week 8 in the first experiment, other than slowing down the spread of algae, the UV had minimal effect on algae that was attached or spread on the surfaces of the rock and tank. So at best, I'd consider it a supportive element to preventing surface algae and certainly not a complete solution. I'd also note that none of these 3 tanks showed any signs of bacterial blooms or related issues as well. So what happens with the same exact experiment setup using brand new, dry Reef Saver Rock that hasn't been exposed to algae or nutrients, which is again one of the most common ways reefers start a new tank, with the exception of being bare bottom and the lights set to max from day 1? Let's take a look at the results from month 1. Much like the first experiment we just saw on established live rock, in the first 2 weeks of dry rock testing, we see that all 3 tanks in week 1 and 2 having little to no change to their bone white surfaces, yet in week 3 the story changes. After 3 weeks, the control tank 1 with no UV installed begins showing signs of a potential bacterial bloom, starting where the tank looks to be a bit hazy, as you can see by the halo-like effect surrounding the aquascape, as well as a tinge of brown appearing in some areas facing the light. Whereas tank 2 at the protozoan low flow rate and tank 3 at the algae and bacterial flow rates both show crystal clear water. The only difference here in week 3 is that the low UV flow tank 2 also begins developing a bit of brown color to the rock surface, whereas tank 3 looks to be just as white and unfazed as it did from the start. Week 4 really shows a visual difference between all 3 test tanks, where the haziness in the control tank looks to be a bit thicker, but tank 2, even without the haze, actually looks the worst, where the surfaces of the rock and even the power heads have what appears to be a brown diatom or algae growth on them. The real standout in this first month of testing is tank 3, set to that higher UV flow rate to process more water through the UV sterilizer, which shows pretty much no change from week to week, despite a little bit of brown growth on the plumbing off of the pump. At face value from the first month of this test, the UV sterilizer set to the proper flow rate for fish parasites has kept the water clear and free of a waterborne bloom, but not preventing algae and bacteria from populating the rock surfaces. However, the UV sterilizer set to the proper flow rate for algae and bacteria sterilization seems to prevent or slow down not just the same bacterial issues we saw in the control tank, but also the spread of algae and bacteria throughout the tank, which again has likely something to do with the amount of water being processed through the sterilizer at these higher recommended flow rates. In this case, with 360 gallons per hour on a 45-gallon tank, that works out to be about 8 times turnover, so processing nearly all of the water multiple times an hour, but still slow enough to sterilize microscopic bacteria and algae spores. But let's see how these results progress into the second month. In the 5th week of testing using the dry Reef Saver Rock, we can tell a pretty dramatic difference between the control tank 1 versus the slow UV flow rate tank 2 and the higher UV flow rate tank 3. Tank 1 looks to be experiencing a full bacterial bloom and is completely hazed over, whereas tank 2 is still crystal clear, yet the brown discoloration of the rock is now turning into longer filamentous growth on the rock surfaces and the bottom of the tank. Tank 3, however, surprisingly looks to be as bone white as the first week the experiment started. The same results are even more pronounced on the new dry rock in week 6, with the haziness in tank 1 beginning to turn green on some rock and glass surfaces. Tank 2's brown growth is growing thicker and even longer, and now in tank 3 we're starting to see growth on the parts of the rock and the pump that are exposed to direct light, but the water still remains crystal clear. In week 7, the tanks are progressing in similar states. The cloudy water in tank 1 seems to be dissipating, but is also being replaced by more green and rock on the glass. Tank 2 is gaining in brown looking matted algae growth, and the green discoloration in tank 3 continues to spread on the lighted surfaces of the rock. Surprisingly, after 8 weeks or 2 months of testing, the control tank 1 without UV has mostly cleared up, and in its place, the rock is showing some beginnings of some brown bacterial or algae growth. Tank 2, with its very slow turnover rate through the UV sterilizer, has evened out to growing a light brown fuzz on nearly all of the surfaces of the rock and some on the bottom of the tank, while also surprisingly tank 3, which was showing promise over the previous 7 weeks, has now developed similar fuzzy algae growth on the rock surfaces and prominently on the bottom of the tank. Okay, so now that we've seen a full 2 months of testing differences between UV sterilizer flow rates on 2 different aquascaping approaches, what did we walk away with? I'll tell you that for me, one is that the old rock is spreading coralline algae even on those tanks with a UV sterilizer installed. However, at this point, the nuisance algae is already unmanageable once it's in there. 2, this test confirms some challenges of starting a new tank using old rock in a replicable manner, even with a UV sterilizer installed, especially if I'm uncertain as to what it's been exposed to. As you can tell from week 1, we didn't have the slightest clue that the ulva algae was even present just from looking at it, and it wasn't until a month into our new tank setup that we could identify it. These types of results are likely why experienced reefers who've experienced similar challenges have gravitated toward using dry rock for many new installs. As for the results of using sterilizers on new tanks with brand new dry Reef Saver Rock, looking at the control non-UV tank that's still somewhat cloudy but seemingly getting clearer, and both tanks with UV sterilizers installed but both showing pretty substantial unidentified algae growth, without throwing guesses at the wall and without redundant and repeatable results, it's difficult to speculate what's happening here and thusly pretty inconclusive to me at this point. All 3 tanks have experienced entirely different issues that I think most reefers would find pretty undesirable. There's no question that the UV prevented the bacterial cloudy bloom, but it wasn't clear as to why the 2 UV tanks at differing flow rates had entirely different pest growth than the non-UV tank. One speculation is that the cloudy bacterial bloom may have consumed or took up nutrients that prevented other types of pest growth, but again, it's hard to say. Just for reference, we took measurements for nitrate and phosphate for all 6 tanks. As you can see, all were severely limited by nitrogen and nitrates, and each had similar phosphorus and phosphate levels, so the nitrate could have absolutely played some sort of role in all of this as well. So rather than to make large guesses based off this one instance in this single test, experiments like this are a shining example of testing big so we can refine future experiments while continuing to refine our collective reefing knowledge sets. Meaning that these types of results most certainly justify further time and effort into more testing to try to clear away the fog. So with that, we're going to shut this one down and start the next, more refined experiment. Before we get into what those changes are going to look like for round 2 of testing, let's go ahead and rate today's questions on our 1 to 10 Reef Fantasy to Reef Certainty scale, where for the question of does the UV sterilizer flow rate setting matter? I'm gonna rate this one a 7 out of 10 on the Reef certainty scale, since in both cases of using older established live rock and in brand new dry rock, although there were distinct signs of slowed algae and bacterial growth on those tanks with the higher UV flow rate, it wasn't a complete home run for keeping it out of the tanks completely. Along with that, not only did the UV sterilizer with the higher flow rate slow the algae growth and spread, it also in all cases kept the bacterial cloud out of the tanks. So with that, I think in the next experiment, we'll be able to get our answer to whether or not UV can help avoid or reduce the brown phase of new tanks. Alright, so what exactly is the next test going to look like? We're going to tear down all 6 of these tanks, clean and sterilize them, then start them back up with a few caveats. The first change we're going to make is to remove some outside variables like the utilitarian Collet tanks and the lawnmower blennies for the obvious reason that algae is a part of their natural diet and keeping them could skew some of the results. Secondly, and the most important component, we plan to create 2 redundant tests by running all 6 tanks with brand new dry Reef Saver Rock, which showed the most compelling data in today's testing. This time with 2 non-UV tanks, 2 tanks with UV at a slow parasite sterilizing flow rate, and 2 with UV set to algae and bacterial flow rates, because redundant results is what provides a more compelling theory. This next time around, we might even follow trends in phosphate and nitrate to see if they are tied to the results, as well as order a USB microscope to see if we can give more definitive results about what's growing on the rock. With all of these changes, we hope to replicate the results from today's initial test, and if we do, we can begin to make more intelligent thoughts around what's actually happening here. I can't tell you how many times this has happened to us before, where we set off to test something interesting or intriguing within the reefing hobby, only to end up creating more and more questions and experiments for us to test. By far, the 4-part series on experiments of refugiums and chaeto testing has been the reefing community's favorite instance of this happening, and to a large degree ours too. So if you're having issues with controlling your nitrates and phosphates, or related pest, algae, and bacterial growth issues, you should definitely check them out over here on this link.